everybody. We really appreciate you coming and taking the extra effort to come out in a storm like this. So I'm sure you're going to feel it was worth it, because Swami Medhanandaji has been amazing. So I'm sure you'll have a good time and enjoy today's session as well. So let's just start with a chant, and we'll do some chant, just a few chants to get kind of releasing the outside world, and then we can focus completely on spiritual matters at hand. So forgive me if I mispronounce any of this. I'm working with somebody. Om Sato Ma Satgamaya Maso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityurma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace. Okay, so since Swamiji's talk is very practical today and covering all the 4 yogas, gives us free latitude to work a little bit on devotion too. Yesterday we were all about Jnana, right? So today we're gonna bring it into the subtle realms and just be. So I thought maybe Baba Hanuman would be a really good start. It's just a fun Krishna Das song. And feel free to please sing along. You'll be able to find a simple melody and so on. At the end, it's just really a Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Sita Rama, Rama Rama. So that's really easy to join in. So for sure, at the end there, we can all get together on it. Okay, and my apologies to Krishna Das.
Hare
Then Ramakrishna started out. I know this is when you guys all like to participate. So all the noise makers. Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye Paru, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye. Vipadi Kevalam, Vipadi Kevalam, Vipadi Kevalam, Sharanam Ye. Vipadi Kevalam, Vipadi Kevalam, Vipadi Kevalam, Sharanam Ye Prabhu Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye Prabhu Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye. Sharanam Daitoham, Sharanam Daitoham, Sharanam Daitoham, Mahale. Sharanam Daitoham, Sharanam Daitoham, Sharanam Daitoham, Mahale. Prabhu Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye Prabhu Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Ramakrishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye. Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Shri Gurave, Namo Jai Jai Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye Prabhu Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ye. Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram. Ram Krishna, Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna, Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam, Ram Krishna Sharanam, Thank you all for participating. Now to the good part. Back in a second. As they say in showbiz, without further ado.
Yeah, this is a little precarious.
How would it
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that was. I thought about that yesterday too.
Stapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupi avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te Namah. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Happy stormy Sunday,
Yes.
and thanks for making it out. And it's been a nice journey. So I see some new faces again today, which is good, and of course some familiar ones. I wanted to thank Jeff because he's done a wonderful job, tirelessly and selflessly organizing everything. He's really doing a tremendous job. It's very impressive, and I'm impressed with how diverse and how thoughtful the whole group is. So I appreciate you coming in. I hope to see you again. Might be coming in November again.
Yes.
First weekend.
First weekend.
Yeah.
It's set in stone.
Okay, so yesterday we had a heavy dose of philosophy. Remember the topic, Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. And I promised that today the talk would be more about the practical application of what we talked about yesterday. So that's what we'll be talking about today. The 4 yogas in spiritual life. Many of you are probably aware of what these yogas are, but let's start sort of from the beginning. What does yoga mean? It has different meanings in different contexts and in different traditions. In the sense that I mean it, and it's not just me, but if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, it's full of references to the word yoga, and it refers to many different kinds of yoga. Yoga, if you go back to the etymology of the term in Sanskrit, it comes from the dhatu, the verbal root yuj, which means to connect. And so a yoga is anything that helps reconnect the soul with the higher reality, with the divine reality. A yoga is any spiritual practice that reconnects the soul with the divine. However you understand the divine, so I'm using very broad language here. And in this regard, many of you might be aware, the word religion in English comes from the Latin term religio, right? And this word etymologically means something very similar to yoga. Why? Re means again. And ligio, it's the same root as ligament, for instance. Connecting, something that connects. So it literally means a religion, etymologically, religion means to reconnect the soul with God. So actually yoga, in its etymological sense, and the term religion in English, in the etymological sense, mean very much the same thing. And I think that if we go back to the original etymological meaning of the word religion, we do well. Why? Because these days the word religion has become almost like a bad word. And people, they're perfectly happy saying, I'm spiritual. But the moment you say I'm religious, people's hackles are raised. And so a lot of people, I have a whole lecture on this called Spiritual But Not Religious, question 1. Because a lot of people, they'll say I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. They add this qualification. Don't think I'm religious. That's fanatical. And it's, But if we go back to the true meaning of the word religion, it means something very sublime and very beautiful and deeply spiritual. Actually, religion at its heart is spiritual. And I think that's what gets lost, unfortunately, these days. We tend to judge religion based on its worst exponents, the most fundamentalist, the most violent groups. But why should we judge anything based on on the worst representatives of that thing? We don't judge science based on the worst scientists. We don't, So why do we judge religion based on the worst so-called religious people? They're not even religious, right? Okay, so that's the first kind of thing I wanted to mention, is that I think that religion has gotten a bad name and a bad rap, but it's unfair. And that the best way to appreciate religion as spirituality is to go back to its etymological roots, which means to reconnect the soul with the divine. I mentioned Bhagavad Gita, one of the great Hindu religious scriptures. You'll find, of course, that Bhagavad Gita talks about many, many yogas. But it does emphasize 4 yogas in particular, right? And we'll talk about them in detail. I'm just going to give you a brief preview here. Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. Karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action, works. Swami Vivekananda calls the 3rd yoga Raja yoga. That term is not really used in the Gita, but the term Dhyana yoga is used in the Gita, which amounts to the same thing more or less. Chapter 6 of the Gita is teachings based on Dhyana yoga. And the 4th yoga is Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, also mentioned in the Gita. But as I said, the Gita doesn't just talk about those 4 yogas. I think one of the most interesting yogas that Krishna talks about in the Gita is in chapter 1. He doesn't use the term, but traditionally, when you recite the Gita, you add what's called a colophon at the end of each chapter. There are 18 chapters. At the end of each chapter, you say something in Sanskrit. It's called a colophon. Om Tat Saliti, Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su, Upanishatsu, Brahma Vidyayam, Yoga Shastre. And then you give the title of the chapter. So these titles are not included in the Gita per se. They're added later, but they're very illuminating, I think. What's the title of chapter 1? So we need a little bit of background in the Gita to understand this. There's a whole narrative on which the Gita is based. What's the narrative? It's about a massive war between 2 families, 2 clans. And Arjuna is the leader of one of these families. He's a great warrior. And Krishna is telling him to fight against this other group. Justly, it's a just war, and Arjuna is on the right side. I'm not going into the details, but Krishna is saying, you need to fight for justice by engaging in this war. And Arjuna in chapter 1 is completely distraught. He becomes paralyzed. Out of fear, out of deep concern and anguish, because the people that he's fighting are his own kith and kin, his own loved ones, his own gurus. How can I kill them? How can I fight them? So this is the narrative structure behind the Bhagavad Gita. And Bhagavan Krishna is explaining to Arjuna why this is not the right attitude, that he has to fight in spite of his concerns. And so he's in deep depression, deep dejection in chapter 1. And so the colophon to chapter 1 is, the title of this chapter is Arjuna Vishada Yoga, which I think is very interesting. The yoga of Arjuna's dejection or sorrow. Sorrow itself, suffering itself can be a yoga. What does that mean? Yoga, remember, means anything that reconnects us with the divine source, right? Can't suffering do that? Doesn't suffering do that in our own lives? If you look back on moments in your life that sort of maybe opened you to spiritual possibilities, that awakened you to spiritual possibilities, were they always moments of joy? No. Probably more often they were moments of suffering. So suffering itself is a very potent spiritual practice. Arthur Schopenhauer, great German philosopher, he was influenced by Vedanta. So this is not a coincidence, but in his great masterpiece, The World is Will and Representation, he said he had great reverence for ascetics and mystics in different religious traditions, in Christianity, in Hinduism, Buddhism. So he's saying, what he says in a large part of the book is, we suffer because we are slaves to what he calls the will, which is basically desire and attachment. And then he asks, well, how do we overcome these desires and attachments? And he says, well, these great saints and mystics in different religious traditions set the example for the rest of us. They engage in tremendous austerities, spiritual practices, ego crushing, and then they attain this state, this transcendental state of illumination, of blissfulness beyond the will. They have these rare exceptions in humanity, have managed to transcend the will through very rigorous spiritual practices, through self-denial, self-abnegation. And then he raises a very interesting question. He says, well, where does that leave the rest of us? Because who are we compared to these great giants, spiritual giants? And are we really capable of that level of austerity and spiritual practice? His answer is no, most of us are not. And he says, but there's a path for the rest of us. says very poignantly, it's the way of suffering. It might sound depressing, but it's true. It's the school of hard knocks. He says for the rest of us, we do what we think is right based on our best lights. We'll make mistakes. We suffer for those mistakes. And if we're mindful in the midst of all our experiences, we can learn from those mistakes, learn from our suffering, so that we can avoid repeating those same mistakes in the future. And in that sense, suffering itself becomes a very powerful yoga. It becomes one of the most powerful spiritual practices. So we should try to suffer mindfully. That's the key. In fact, Swami Medhanandaji, he once said, suffering is the great eye-opener. People who are deeply immersed in worldliness, their problem is they don't suffer mindfully. They suffer unmindfully. So what happens? They make a mistake, they suffer for it, but they don't think about the root cause of that suffering. Oh, I made a mistake, and therefore I should try to avoid it. So what happens? They repeat the same mistakes over and over again. They undergo the same suffering over and over again without learning from it, right? That's why suffering mindfully is really important. Another thing that Swami Medhanandaji says, which I think is very, very profound and practical and helpful in day-to-day life. He says, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. See, he's not preachy. He's not telling you to do this and not do that. But he says, whatever you do, whatever experiences you undergo, undergo these experiences mindfully. Try to learn something from every experience. Whatever it is, good or bad or neutral, right? So another thing I wanted to mention, I mean, the title is The 4 Yogas in Spiritual Life. But there are many yogas, and I don't want to restrict them to just 4. There are 4, you could say, main yogas. But as I said, suffering is another yoga, and there are many more. Sri Aurobindo, another great Vedantin, he used to say, all life is yoga. And I love that statement. Every moment of life is an opportunity for us to reconnect with the divine. So I think that's the right attitude, but today, because it's kind of a little bit too unwieldy if I start talking about a million different yogas, and each of us should ask ourselves, what yoga best suits me? You know, right now, where I stand now, in August 2023. And you move forward from there. The other thing I wanted to mention, even though we're going to focus on these 4 yogas, they're not in airtight compartments. There's a lot of overlap between the yogas. You can often you'll find it difficult to actually strictly separate, for instance, karma yoga from bhakti yoga from dhyana yoga or raja yoga. You know, we'll get to that more in a bit, but I just wanted to flag that. So I don't want to make it seem as if these yogas are completely separate and that there's no overlap between them. Often there is overlap. And you might ask, well, what's the aim of all these yogas? The aim of all these yogas is, as I've already kind of talked about, to reconnect us with our divine source, right? And thereby eliminate the suffering that's in our lives and remove our ignorance of the divine. Every single yoga has that aim. And it does so by purifying our minds. So we can say very simply, every yoga aims at ego crushing, Operation Ego Crushing. Every yoga, whether it's Bhakti, whether it's Jnana, whether it's Karma, whether it's Dhyana, our problem is that we so closely identify with the ego, and that ego is the root of all our suffering. So if we can overcome the ego, if we can destroy the ego, all our problems are solved. Ami mole bhujbe janjal is what Sri Ramakrishna used to say. When that ego dies, all trouble cease. And so take your pick of yoga, because every yoga has the same aim of ego crushing, right? Keep that in mind as we move forward, as we discuss the 4 yogas in some detail. So now let's discuss each of these 4 yogas. The first one is karma yoga. It's in no particular order, but I think in many ways, karma yoga is the most practical and the most relevant to us. Because many of you have full-time jobs, and you've got a spouse, you've got children. So how do you go about your household duties? How do you transform your household duties, your day-to-day activities, into a spiritual practice? The secret is karma yoga. And one of the first scriptures to teach karma yoga in detail is the Bhagavad Gita, as many of you know, probably, starting in chapter 2. There's a very famous verse in Gita, chapter 2, verse 47. In India, when I was in 4th grade in Boston, I was given the choice between French and Spanish, and I chose French. But in India, at least in my parents' generation, from a young age, they're given Sanskrit instruction. They're not usually taught grammar, but they're kind of forced to memorize verses, sometimes from the Gita. This is one of the standard ones. Karmanye vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. You have the right to karma, to actions, but not to the fruits thereof. And if you covet the fruits of your actions, that is a recipe for suffering and sorrow. And this raises a really interesting question, which I've gotten a lot from people who hear, and they're very sincere, and they're not like skeptics, but they say, when I hear this teaching, I get the sense that Krishna is telling us to do our work kind of half-heartedly. Don't think about God while you're doing the work, and do it sort of in a mediocre way. That's not his teaching. That's a misunderstanding, I think, of karma yoga. What Krishna means by karma yoga, but it's a useful misunderstanding. It's one that generates what exactly it helps us to arrive at how should we engage in karma yoga in our household duties in the world to make it karma yoga. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're a surgeon. Let's say you're a heart surgeon, so very critical kind of surgeries, right? And there's a critical patient who comes in. You are asked to perform a life-saving surgery. You've got lots of experience. And you go in, and you're trying to do this as karma yoga. What does that mean? Bhagavad Gita, this is in chapter 18, verse 26. It explains what our attitude should be when we're trying to do action as karma yoga. Mukta sango nahambadi dhrityutsaha samanditaha siddhi siddhyo nirvikaraha karta sattvika uchyate. The sattvika actor or doer has the following characteristics. Mukta sangha, which means you're completely free from attachments. Attachments to what? Attachments to the fruits of your work, to whatever you're going to do. We're going to get to that very soon in this particular case. What are the fruits of the work in the case of this surgeon who has to perform a critical surgery? We'll get to it. Well, we can talk about it now. So the fruits of, there are two different things, right? One is success or failure. Does he succeed? Does the surgery succeed in saving the life of the patient? In a sense, that's the fruit, right? There are other fruits. Could be this surgeon might be ambitious and he's trying to rise the ranks in his hospital or his university. And so if I can save this patient's life, and this guy's a really famous guy, this person I'm going to operate on, if I do a good job, word's going to go around that I'm a great surgeon. I might get that promotion I've been looking for. I have more money. I can buy that Porsche that I've always wanted. My name might be in the newspaper. Fruits. These are examples of fruits, right? What's not being said by Krishna here is do the work half-heartedly. Do it sort of detach your mind and God and just go through the motions. No, it's not about going through the motions. Krishna specifies specifically, Mukta Sango, Anahambadi. Do this work, whatever work is allotted to you, but do it without ego. Without getting puffed up with pride. He might be a world-famous surgeon, but when he's doing the surgery, he or she shouldn't feel that I'm a great surgeon and become boastful about it. Even if you're not bragging verbally, you might be thinking that. I'm so great, look. I'm going to save this patient's life. Sri Ramakrishna says God laughed twice. God laughs twice. Once when there are two brothers fighting over a particular land or property. And he said, no, this is my property. The other brother said, no, it's my property. God laughed. Why? Because they're neither of their properties. It's God. Everything is God's properties. The second time God laughs, Sri Ramakrishna says, is when a doctor says to a patient, I will save you. Because no doctor, no human being has any capacity, any ability to save anyone else. Only God has that. That's what Krishna is saying. Is that he's telling the surgeon, in this case, in our example, don't covet name and fame. and more importantly, I mean, that's one thing so that's one aspect of fruits that you should not be coveting, that you should not be looking for. But another thing is, do the work to the best of your ability. And he says, Anahambali, dhriti utsaha samandita. Be fully endowed with dhriti and utsaha. These are Sanskrit words. Dhriti means with perseverance. Stick until the very end. Work your very hardest. Don't give up in the middle. So don't do this half-heartedly. And he adds, just so there's absolutely no confusion about this, utsaha. Do the work with full enthusiasm, with full energy, with full spirit behind it. Not half-heartedly. You see, he's adding these words very specifically to remove any doubt that you should be doing this in some kind of half-hearted way without your heart fully in it. And then, Dhriti Utsaha Samanta, Siddha Siddho Nirvikara. Here, this is very important. Equal in success and failure. What does success mean in the case of this surgery? It means that he succeeds in saving the life of the patient, right? The patient lives. Failure would mean he doesn't live. What does Krishna say? This is a hard teaching. This is what requires practice, actually. The surgeon, if he's a karma yogi, when he's performing the surgery, he should be telling himself, I am going to do this surgery to the best of my ability, with tremendous perseverance, with full of enthusiasm. But whether I succeed or fail is up to God. So there's a popular saying in India, do your best and leave the rest. That's karma yoga. You do your best from your side. But whether the patient succeeds, lives or dies, is not up to you. And if after all of your efforts, the patient does die, the karma yogi will not become dejected. That doesn't mean that the surgeon is hard-hearted. There's a difference here, right? It's not that he's hard-hearted. It means that he is so dependent on God. He's surrendered completely to God. And he says, look, I've done my best, O Lord, but you've decided to take this patient away from this end, right? So that's the true attitude of the karma. Okay, and then you might say, well, that sounds pretty tough. And it is. It's easier said than done. And it's a work. We're all works in progress. That's what spiritual practice is all about. It's not something that happens overnight. That we, right, before we engage in spiritual practice, we're fully attached to our actions, and that's another form of attachment. Actually, there's attachment to fruits of our actions. There's also attachment to the work itself. Some people are so attached to a particular kind of action that if you, for a few days, if you say you can't do that kind of work, like imagine like a runner who loves running and suddenly they get an injury. What happens? They become depressed. Not always, but so that's also a kind of bondage. It's also a kind of it's a worldly attachment, right? So if you're a karma yogi, even if you love running, for instance, and suddenly you get an ankle sprain or something, so you're out of commission for a couple of weeks. You have to do swimming instead. God forbid. But you won't be totally depressed. So wait to death here. We're talking about swimming. He doesn't seem to like it. Yeah. So another form of attachment to work is to the work itself, right? Not just the fruits, but you're so addicted to one particular kind of work. If suddenly you're not able to do that work, you become depressed. So again, don't fall into that trap either. Okay. And then you might ask, oh, okay, another thing is, I already mentioned that these yogas are not in airtight compartments, right? And specifically with karma yoga, what you'll find if you study the Gita carefully, whenever Krishna talks about karma yoga, I don't want to say whenever, but in most places, when he explains that you should engage in actions with full enthusiasm, but without being attached to the fruits or to the work itself, he often explains the process of doing karma yoga using bhakti. Karma yoga and bhakti yoga are inseparable in the Bhagavad Gita. In chapter 3, there's a verse which explains how you almost have to combine karma yoga with bhakti yoga. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasyadhyatma chetasa nirashi nimamo bhutva yuthyasva vigatachvaraha. Krishna is telling Arjuna, Mayi sarvani karmani, whatever you do, and not just quote unquote religious or spiritual things, whatever you're doing in the course of the day, Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chetasa, offer them to me. Whatever you're doing, do it as a form of worship and offering to me, God. Sanyasya adhyatma chetasa, with your mind dwelling on God within and on your true spiritual nature, beyond the body-mind complex. You're actually an eternal soul. You're a servant of God. You're a child of God. And everything you're doing is an offering to God. It's a form of worship. Whatever you're doing. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chitsa nirashi nimmamo bhutva yutyasva vigata jvaraha. Without any expectations, without any desires for, through this action I will get this or do this or get name and fame. Without any of that. Nimmamo bhutva. Mama in mamata in Sanskrit means me and mine. Without any sense that I'm doing this because I'm so great and I alone can do this and look at how great I am for having done this. No, without any of that, without that egoism. Yutyasva vigata jvaraha. Krishna says fight. And here fight it's not just in a war, but this whole world is a kind of battlefield. And we're fighting with our own egos. Fight devoid of the fever of the soul or the fever of egoism, the fever of selfishness. Most of us, you'll find, are going through life with a fever. Not a physical fever, but with the kind of spiritual fever. We suffer from the fever of egoism, because it makes us feel not well, it makes us suffer. And if you get a really high fever, what happens is you get deluded. You start almost kind of looking at the world in the wrong way and saying the wrong things to people. You get kind of loopy. That's what happens when you become the slave of the ego. And so through karma yoga, you can overcome ego. You can do everything, literally everything you do in the course of the day, getting up from bed, preparing breakfast, raising your children, going to work, doing work, all of that can become a form of worship. So karma yoga and bhakti yoga are kind of inextricably intertwined, at least according to Bhagavad Gita, but also according to many of the great saints who talk about karma yoga. Another question that comes up in the context of karma yoga, okay, well, what kind of work should we do? And you'll find that Bhagavad Gita is very, very broad. Chapter 9, one of the famous verses, another famous verse, Bhagavan Krishna says, Yat karoshi, yadashnasi, yadjuhoshi, dadasi yat tapassi kaunteya tat kurushva madaprana. Whatever you do, yat karoshi, yadashnasi, whatever you eat, all of us have to eat in order to preserve the body. Yadashnasi, yadjuhoshi, dadasi whatever sacrifices you make in the course of your day. We make sacrifices all the time. Don't think that sacrifice only means Vedic sacrifice. It means anything. Anytime you forego some kind of activity that you would have done with your friend because your kid needs to be taken to this activity, that's a sacrifice. All sorts of daily sacrifices that we make in the course of the day. Those sacrifices, do them not grudgingly, like, darn it, I really would have loved that concert. Now I have to drop off my kid. No, say, I'm doing this out of love for my child and as an offering to God. And even if in the one thing as a karma yogi, you have to be mindful. So it might be that, let's say that you've been planning for months to go with your friend to some kind of really great concert or something. And then suddenly something comes up, maybe your kid falls ill, you have to take your kid to the hospital. In that first moment, you might say, darn it, I was really looking for that concert. Offer that darn it to God. You can open your heart to God and say, that's not my best moment. But just be honest. The beauty of it is you can open your heart and you open your soul to God and God will take care of the rest. That's karma yoga. Is catching yourself in the moment of that slight irritation or frustration. Okay, but what kind of work? But Gita doesn't stop there. So the basic position is any work can become karma yoga. It's all about the inner attitude with which you do your work, with which you do that work, whether it's raising your kids, whether it's going to your full-time job, whatever it is. Doing exercise. My next Sunday talk in Hollywood is called Spiritualizing Physical Fitness. Even exercise can be a spiritual practice. Okay, but there's another dimension of this question. Krishna also talks about, there are two terms that come up very frequently in the Gita, Swabhava and Swadharma. Swabhava means your inner law of being, what makes you tick. Swadharma means something very similar. It means like what your vocation is, what you feel called to do in life. Calling, calling in the deeper sense. What do you feel called to do? some people, especially in India, but it's true in Asian countries, but I think it's still true in the West, but less so. You major in a particular subject, you end up doing a certain job, not because it's your calling, because you feel called to it, but because maybe your parents are forcing you to do it or really want you to do it, or you want to impress society or something like that. These are not the best reasons for doing something. Choose your major, choose your career based on your calling. What are you called to do? Based on your own unique talents, your own unique gifts, your preferences. Krishna says the same thing. Krishna says, you will make the most rapid spiritual progress and you will maximally benefit society if you do the work which is swabhava niyatam. Swabhava niyatam karma is a term used in chapter 18 of the Gita. Swabhava niyatam karma means actions that are in accordance with your swabhava, with your own inner law of being. And this is logical. On the one hand, with respect to the individual as a spiritual aspirant, how does it help us? Because we're tapping into our own unique strengths. And we really feel, we're all of us are born with certain talents and certain gifts. Where do these come from? God has given them to us. Why don't we use them to the best of our ability to serve God? Give back our talents to God. Right? If we spend all our time trying to get really good at something that we're terrible at, it's not that that's bad. That's also good in a certain way. But we're wasting valuable energy. Instead of that, if we can first identify what your main strengths are, and then find a calling that taps into those strengths, that helps us to cultivate those strengths, then we'll be able to make very rapid spiritual progress. We'll also be able to benefit society. That's very logical because what? If a person's calling is to be a doctor, but society is structured in such a way that that person is forced to go into law, what's going to happen? He's not going to be a very good lawyer, right? So the best functioning society is one in which it allows every individual to engage in the kind of activity, the kind of work that best suits each individual nature, right? So this is what Krishna talks about. Now, another thing that's really worth talking about, at least briefly, is this is very cutting edge stuff, actually, even though Gita is a very old ancient scripture. But this is only recently being talked about by contemporary psychologists. Especially, there's a subfield of psychology called positive psychology. Does anyone know what positive psychology means? What, anyone? You're about to raise your hand, any kind of excited. Anyone know? Positive psychology. The idea is, psychology from its inception, and it's not a very old field actually. It kind of started in the 19th century with Freud and others. But what did Freud and others focus on? Neurotics. People with debilitating mental illnesses, basically. And what was the aim of psychological therapy, psychoanalytic therapy and all that? The aim is to help that patient get rid of that mental illness and become, quote unquote, normal. Wo es war, da ich sein soll. It's a German formula coined by Sigmund Freud. He says, where the unconscious was, there the ego shall be. But that can't be the ultimate goal. Just being our normal egos can't be the be-all and end-all in life. So positive psychology picks up where sort of older psychology leaves off. Okay, we're normal, we're healthy, functioning human beings, but we're still not fulfilled. Something is still missing from our lives. That's where most of us are at. Many of us. Positive psychology helps you to become the best person you can possibly be. How do you find fulfillment in life? And one of the most prominent positive psychologists, his name is Martin Seligman. He wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. Have any of you read the book or heard of it? Have you read it? Yeah. So what he says is, I'm giving a very brief summary here, but he says, first step in achieving fulfillment and true happiness, authentic happiness in life, is to identify what your signature strengths are. He calls them signature strengths. What am I best at? And he helps us because he's developed a survey, which you can take online. I can give you guys the link. Maybe I can put it in the YouTube description there. And you fill out the survey, and it just rank orders your 5 greatest strengths, like that. And it goes on so that when you go down the list, you're like, oh, okay, I'm not very good at this. That's also helpful, knowing what your weaknesses are too, right? What are my main strengths? What are my weaknesses? And then he says, after identifying your strengths and weaknesses, your own signature strengths, try to engage in the work, like in your day-to-day life, try to incorporate activities that best tap into and cultivate those signature strengths, whatever they may be. And then you're going to find this is a recipe for lasting fulfillment and happiness. And that's very similar to Bhagavan Krishna's teachings in the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah.
I read that book, but as per Carl Jung's philosophy, we have the archetypes, right? 60 different archetypes. So are those archetypes define what we are, and there is no way to change it because we are stereotyped like that by virtue of our birth? There is no way to change it, and we are like that only.
Yeah. So you're talking about Carl Jung, another 20th century figure. And you have this idea of archetypes. So we go in a different direction if we talk about it. So I don't want to go into the details of the different psychologists, but that's why I'm focusing specifically on Bhagavad Gita. So the Gita psychology of Swabhava, Swadharma on the one hand, and this Martin Seligman's idea, where he doesn't really say that we have, it's not so much fixed archetypes, but it's just true that some people are born pianists and other people are, born debaters or philosophers, right? That doesn't mean that you don't need to practice and cultivate that. But if you can identify what your strengths are and then really work on them, you'll become the best pianist you can be, the best doctor you can be, right? That's the logic. So there's a truth to the fact that we're not kind of blank slates. I think that would be wildly unrealistic to claim that. In more technical Hindu terms, we are all born with certain samskaras, latent mental tendencies from previous births. Mozart, he was a child prodigy, right, with music, but that's because he practiced a lot of music in his previous life. So we can't deny that. At the same time, to say that we're just fixed the way we are for eternity, that's also not right. I mean, we should think of ourselves as works in progress, as I said. We evolve. That's part of what spiritual life is about. And I wanted to mention one more thing before we move on to the other three yogas. This is the first of the four. It's something I already started talking about yesterday. I think that one of Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Medhanandaji's main contributions to our understanding of Karma Yoga is what Sri Ramakrishna used to call Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. Serve others in a spirit of worship by seeing God in it. This is a very powerful form of Karma Yoga. And it's one that all of us can practice. And in fact, there are more studies coming out that they're trying to figure out, like, depression is at an all-time high, especially in the more affluent countries. How do we help these people who are suffering from depression? Many studies, scientific studies, have found that one thing that I'm going to talk about next week in my Sunday talk is exercise, which a lot of people don't like doing, but it's a tremendous way. It's more effective than antidepressants. These are objective scientific studies which show this. But another very potent remedy, treatment for depression is serving others. There are also studies on this. Because part of what depression is you're just so trapped in yourself. You can't get out of your own head. And you start feeling sorry for yourself. You get trapped in this cycle of feeling sorry for yourself. What's the best way to get out of your head, of your own head, and out of this kind of sort of self-absorption? Serve others. And you don't have to teach them any philosophy. Just say, like, go to a soup kitchen. And they're going to automatically start feeling better. It's a remarkable thing, but it's true and it's documented in these studies. Okay, so that's a lot on Karma Yoga. Now let's talk about Bhakti Yoga. And as I said, there's a lot of overlap. You can't really practice Karma Yoga without some Bhakti Yoga. There is a way. There's also a kind of, as Swami Medhanandaji used to say, there is a kind of atheistic form of Karma Yoga. If you don't believe in any God, it's just really hard. The nice thing about combining Karma Yoga with Bhakti Yoga is that, as Krishna says, whatever you're doing, the easiest way not to be attached to the work and to the fruits is, I'm offering the fruits to God. Let God take care of the rest. I'll do my best and leave the rest. If you don't have anyone to lean on, if you don't believe in a God, you just have to kind of just by sheer force of will say, I'm going to do this, but not get attached to the work and not get attached to the fruits. But as I said, it's easier said than done. So getting God's help is tremendously helpful. But now let's talk about Bhakti Yoga proper. Bhakti Yoga. What is Bhakti Yoga? The yoga of devotion. Devotion towards whom or what? The personal God. What do I mean by personal God? This created some confusion yesterday. The personal God is not a person in the sense that I'm talking to you now. Not in that sense. Not with a human body. No, nothing like that. Personal God means a supreme being to whom we can pray, who listens to our prayers, who responds to our prayers, who looks after us like we're his own or her own children. That's the personal God that I'm talking about. Who's omniscient, who knows, who's all-knowing, who's omnipotent, all-powerful, who cares for us, who looks after us, right? That's what I mean by the personal God. And Bhakti Yoga is any practice, any devotional practice, any form of worship, even just thinking about God. Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel, he talks a lot about Sharanmana in Bengali, which means constant recollection. Just think of God. One of the best ways to think of God is what? By mentally repeating a mantra. And so Raja Maharaj, who became Swami Medhanandaji later in his life, he was always in this kind of a state of ecstasy. And he would often sit next to Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna would notice that his lips would move slightly, just like that, but very quietly, without saying anything. And then his father came one day to visit. And Sri Ramakrishna, he was very good at sort of trying to win over parents of young renunciates. And so he was praising Raja Maharaj to his father, saying, he's a highly spiritual, wonderful person, and just notice how his lips are slightly moving because he's always taking God's name. So that's a very potent form of devotional practice. Constantly taking God's name. It doesn't mean that it has to be with concentration. You should try to repeat God's name when you can, especially when you're sitting morning and evenings during meditation practice. But even when you're driving, you can repeat the name. Don't get into accidents. But you can do it. It might be in the back of your mind. You may not be thinking in a very overt way about God, but just the repetition itself. Holy Mother used to say, when somebody said, Upaiki, what you do? We're householders, we don't have time for deep meditation. She points to a clock. It's digital, unfortunately. But at that time, there was analog clocks with the second hand. She goes, see that second hand? Tick, 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 tick. Just like that, you should take God's name. As much, as often as you can. At every opportunity. When you're washing dishes, you can't take God's name? Of course you can. Right? So that's japa. It's called japa. That's a very important form of Bhakti Yoga. Puja, the arati that we just did, Bhakti Yoga. Bhajans, the beautiful bhajans that Jeff sang. Bhajans. All of these, calling on God, praying. Prayer is a very powerful form of spiritual practice. Okay, and there are many others. Sri Ramakrishna, he used to say, Kolite Narodya Bhakti. In this Kali Yuga, the best and easiest path is Bhakti Yoga. Why? What does he mean by Kali Yuga? He meant that in this age where people are full of body consciousness, we're so closely identified with our bodies and we're so obsessed with catering to the body and its desires. I want this, I want that. That he says that the best practice for us people, for most of us, is Bhakti Yoga. What about Karma Yoga? Because he also praised Karma Yoga. But another thing that he warned about is, we talked about this yesterday, Beta, we were talking about, or at least 2 days ago. He said, there's always this danger of ego creeping into Karma Yoga. I might go to the soup kitchen, but when I go, I'm kind of seeing how many people are watching me, and then afterward, I kind of want recognition for having done that. I might drop it in the course of a conversation with a friend, like, oh, what'd you do on Saturday? And my friend went, oh, I went to a concert. I said, oh, that's nice. And then the friend might ask, oh, what'd you do? I said, oh, I went to a soup kitchen. Ego, in a subtle form. It's very hard to escape the ego, the snares of the ego. Because even if it's not in a gross form, it's there in a subtle form, in many cases. So it's very tricky. And Bhakti Yoga has certain unique advantages. I'm not saying that Bhakti Yoga is easy, but comparatively, it's fraught with fewer dangers for ordinary spiritual aspirants. What are some of these advantages? Why does Sri Ramakrishna say that the best path for our age is Bhakti Yoga? I want to mention a couple of things. Number one, no eligibility requirements. This is a big thing because the path of knowledge, as we'll see a little bit later in our discussion today, they set a very high bar for those who are at least traditional Advaita Vedanta. Says you've got to have X, Y, and Z. We'll get to what the X, Y, and Z are. Just to even get off the ground, to even get started on the path. Bhakti, nothing. Anybody, God takes us as we are, where we are, and says you can start right where you are. That's a tremendous advantage. Another advantage, unlike some other spiritual paths, which are based entirely on our own willpower, self-effort, it's called Purushakana, the path of bhakti is full of grace and light. Why? Because you have someone to depend on. You've got the all-powerful God, the all-loving God, to rely on, and to trust, and to surrender to, and to open your heart to, and to express your frustrations to, and say, you know, I did my best today to perform that surgery without attachments, but in the back of my mind, I still want name and fame. I want that promotion. You can, by confessing those weaknesses to God, you're making spiritual progress. That itself becomes bhakti yoga. So that brings me to the third advantage. This is something that's a little bit more subtle. One of the unique things about bhakti yoga is you can turn your biggest weaknesses into strengths. In the gospel, if you've read the whole gospel, you told me that in a few days, you read the entire gospel. Ramakrishna will often give examples of prayer. He'll say, this is the kind of prayer you should do. One of them, he says, oh, Mother, Divine Mother, I am completely devoid of any kind of detachment from the world. I'm not able to engage in any sincere spiritual practices, completely devoid of devotion. I have no capacity for knowledge. I surrender at your lotus feet. Do with me what you will. Admitting your own weaknesses to God is itself a very powerful spiritual practice, and thereby becomes a strength. And so you learn humility. It makes you humble. Just confessing your weaknesses to God itself makes you humble. And remember that the aim of all yogas is ego crushing. So doesn't that help? No, right? So that's the beauty of it. So you can turn your greatest weaknesses into your greatest strengths through bhakti, through the kind of alchemy of bhakti yoga. That's the beauty of it. There's a lot more I can say, but we can, if you have questions about bhakti yoga or any of the yogas, we can talk about them a little bit later. So let's get to the two other yogas. Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. As I said, we talked about them. One thing about these terms is that they sometimes mean different things in the minds of different people, and that creates some confusion. It seems to me that there are narrower and broader ways of defining Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. Let's start with the narrower. What do I mean by narrower? I don't mean in a bad sense. I mean that there are different schools of philosophy which give kind of technical definitions of the path of knowledge. The one that's by far the most popular is Shankara's path of knowledge, right? And it's based on one particular Upanishad, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. It talks about Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. And Shankara really highlights this mantra from the Upanishad and says, this is Jnana yoga. This is the path of knowledge. Shravana, first step, listening, hearing, what? The Mahavakya. You are Brahman, or Aham Brahmasmi. I am that non-dual pure consciousness from a qualified guru. Second step in Jnana yoga, Manana, reflection. Think deeply about that great saying, that Mahavakya. In what sense am I Brahman? Remove doubts from your mind. Well, what if this, what if that? Think about objections that people might raise against this idea that I am Brahman. Well, but then why do I think I'm the body? Why don't I know that I'm Brahman? And all the answers to these questions. That's in the Manana stage, reflection, removal of doubts. Third, Nididhyasana. Even after reflection, that's not the goal. You need to deeply internalize this idea that you are non-dual pure consciousness. It shouldn't just be a kind of intellectual idea. You need to really live it in the deepest way possible. And if you do things the right way, all three of these procedures, what should happen? You eventually attain knowledge of Brahman. Your ignorance of Brahman is completely eradicated. This is Shankara's conception of Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. But what many people don't know, even many Hindus who know something about Indian philosophy, don't know that there are other forms of Jnana yoga taught by other Vedantins, by other schools of Vedanta. And I'll just mention one. Ramanujan, the great philosopher of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, which means qualified non-dualism. He also fully accepts Jnana yoga, but not in the same sense as Shankara. What is Jnana yoga according to Ramanuja? This is also kind of a narrow way of thinking of Jnana yoga. That's what I mean by narrow. It's like a more sectarian way of understanding what Jnana yoga is. So Shankara has one sectarian way of explaining Jnana yoga based on Advaita Vedanta. Ramanuja says, here's Jnana yoga. You need to meditate on your true spiritual nature as an eternal soul, divine soul, a child of God, separate from the psychophysical complex. You're not the body, you're not even the mind. You're actually an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. This sounds a lot like Shankara in a way, and actually there are a lot of similarities. We think that Shankara himself, his school is the only one that taught that we're not the body-mind complex. Absolutely wrong. Every school of Vedanta, all the Bhakti schools of Vedanta equally agree with Shankara that we're not the body-mind complex, that we're an eternal soul. But according to the Bhakti schools, each individual soul is different. You have one soul, you have another soul, and each is intimately united with God, connected with God. And we suffer because we don't know. We mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. So even for Ramanuja, to attain the heights of bhakti, you have to first practice Jnana Yoga. We'll get to that a little later too in more detail. It's a very profound teaching. Why? He says, so long as you identify with the body, you won't feel that natural, spontaneous bhakti within your heart, because it's only the soul, separate from the body-mind complex, that really feels this innate bhakti for God. Okay? Okay, and one thing I wanted to mention, with regard to Shankara's, so I should have said this before I went into Ramanuja, but Shankara says you need all sorts of prerequisites in order to embark on the path of knowledge. What are they? He calls them sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold path, fourfold sadhana, spiritual practices. One is viveka, intense renunciation, intense detachment toward the things of the world. Vairagya, so having no worldly attachment to desires. How many people can say that they are completely free from worldly attachments and desires? Almost nobody. Disqualified, unfortunately. The first one is viveka. So I just explained the second one, vairagya. First one is viveka. Viveka is discrimination, not racial discrimination. Not that. It's in a good sense. It means discrimination between what's real and what's unreal, what's permanent, what's impermanent. Right? All these ephemeral pleasures that we see in the world and all these attachments that we have, the moment we die, all disappear. What is that? That's discrimination in the spiritual sense. So discrimination, intense dispassion and renunciation, being completely free from worldly attachment, that's vairagya. Shatsampa, the 6 treasures in spiritual life. I won't go through all of them, but there are all these wonderful spiritual qualities like perfect self-control, having mastery over your senses, the sense organs. If you really have mastery, they won't be outgoing anymore. Most people are kind of, they're like monkeys. They see something and their mind immediately moves in that direction because of desires, right? But this person will have such strong self-control that the senses are kind of inward turned. Control of mind is called shama. So control of sense organs is very high. This is even higher. Control of the mind itself. How many people can say that they have that? And so many other qualities. And finally, mumukshutva, it's the 4th quality. Intense longing for liberation, for knowledge of Brahman. Intense longing, a genuine knowledge, not just a kind of intellectual longing, but a really deep yearning for liberation. So without all 4 of these prerequisites, you're not eligible to practice path of knowledge, according to Shankara, and at least traditional followers of Shankara.
That means Jnana Yoga is not for family people.
It's not for the majority. Yeah, there might be some who are qualified. It's not for most monks, frankly. Yeah, because just by wearing giddo, it doesn't make you suddenly have all these wonderful spiritual qualities. We're also works in progress. It's not for most people. It's very difficult. And what's happening these days is there are these modern Advaitic teachers who kind of open the floodgates to everybody and really downplay or completely ignore these eligibility requirements. And I think it's dangerous because it's very easy to slip into self-deception and to think that I'm Brahman. Just by hearing one lecture or something, you already think you're Brahman, and that's it. I don't have to do anything more. This reminds me of an incident when before I became a monk, I went to India to be a monk. And before joining the Ramakrishna order, I did a 6-month pilgrimage. And I was in a place called Kodaikanala, in the foothills of the Himalayas, very beautiful hill station. And I walked into a bakery, and I was wearing white, the clothes of a brahmachari like Jeff is wearing. And the lady working there, the baker, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, what? It looks like you're a spiritual aspect." I said, "Yeah, I'm going to join the Ramakrishna mission. I want to be a sannyasi." And she gave me this look. She said, "Oh, why go to all that trouble? I'm a follower of Ramana Maharaj. And he said that you should dive into the Atman. So why don't you just dive into the Atman?" And I said, if it were that easy, then but it's not that easy. Go ahead and try to dive, and you're going to hit concrete. You're going to fall flat on your face. Because you need prerequisites, you need preparation for diving into the Atma. You need bhakti, you need karma, you need all these things, purity of mind especially. Another incident that comes to mind. This is in the biography of Sri Ramakrishna, written by Swami Medhanandaji. During his spiritual practice, period of spiritual practice, Sri Ramakrishna had heard that there was a sannyasi who was visiting the area. But he heard some rumors that, from valid sources, that he was, even though a sannyasi is supposed to be completely celibate, not be involved with any women, he was having an affair with women. And you know, Sri Ramakrishna, I don't know if he knows, but he's very straightforward, like blunt to a fault. So I justify my own bluntness by giving him as an example. And so he approaches this monk, and he goes, "Hey, welcome. What's this I hear about this lady and this monk?" Just like that smile that the baker gave me. He says, "Oh, let me explain. You see," and he was a follower of Shankara. You see what I mean? Why I put it in scare quotes. He says, "You see, all of this is Maya. It's all unreal. It's all part of my dream. If that's true, if everything is Maya, how can my affair with that woman alone be real?" You see the danger of self-deception on the path of knowledge. If you don't have the prerequisites, I'm not knocking the path. I'm saying, if you don't really have the prerequisites, the spiritual prerequisites, to qualify you for that path, you will end up falling flat on your face 99 times out of 100. And there's this great danger in convincing yourself. Everybody wants to feel that they're already eligible. Yeah. Other people aren't eligible for the path of knowledge, but I am. Again, what is that? Isn't that ego? Obviously, it's ego. It's so funny because some of the biggest egos I've seen are the so-called Advaitins, bragging about the fact that their path is the highest, about how other paths are based on blind faith, but my path alone is the most rational, and I'm the most rational person because I'm following that path, and it's all about patting yourself on the back at the end of the day. Why is that ultimately? It's not because there's anything wrong with the path. It's an incredible path if you're eligible to practice it. And if you're not, there are great dangers. Okay, and the fourth yoga, Raja Yoga, otherwise known as Dhyana Yoga. Oh, sorry, I promised that I would mention that. So there's a narrower and a broader way of understanding Jnana Yoga, right? I explained basically two different narrower senses of Jnana Yoga. One is Shankara's, which is the path of knowledge according to Advaita Vedanta. The second one is, what did I say? Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita conception of Jnana Yoga, which is meditate deeply on your true nature as an eternal individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. Because only then will you feel this spontaneous natural bhakti welling up from within. And then you can really practice bhakti in earnest. But there's a broader way that Swami Vivekananda and others define Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. You'll find in certain places, he just uses one word to define Jnana Yoga. He doesn't say the Advaitic path of knowledge, Shravana, Manana. No, he doesn't say any of that. He says philosophy. He uses one word. It's very interesting. Sometimes he says reasoning or inquiry. So the broader understanding of the path of knowledge, this is very, very broad. It's any spiritual practice that requires intellectual reflection, inquiry, removal of doubts. This is like the manana phase, intellectual reflection, thoughtfulness. That's the broader understanding of Jnana Yoga. You'll find that not just in many different Hindu paths. You'll find it even in Bhakti. You'll find it in Christianity. There's a whole rich tradition of what's called faith-seeking understanding. You accept what the Bible teaches, but you're also raising difficult questions. Well, if God loves me, why does He make me suffer so much? What did I do to deserve it? It's not that you're doubting God. You have faith, but you're seeking understanding. That's another example of Jnana Yoga in this broader sense. So there's both a kind of a narrow sectarian understanding of Jnana Yoga, and I've given two examples, Shankara's and Ramanuja's. And there's also a much broader, which I think is more relevant to us in day-to-day life, right? Because all of us have brains, and especially in this modern age, all sorts of doubts come into our mind. Whenever a doubt comes, and we're all spiritual aspirants, so when a doubt comes, we shouldn't feel guilty about having those doubts. We should try to actually remove those doubts. That process is called Jnana Yoga in the broader sense. Okay, let's keep that in mind. So just as Jnana Yoga has a narrower sense and a broader sense, Raja Yoga has a narrower sense and a broader sense. The narrower sense is explained by Swami Medhanandaji in his book called Raja Yoga. because he doesn't just explain Raja Yoga, he has an entire translation into English of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, right, one of the great text of yoga practice. So in the narrower sense, what Raja Yoga means is the practice of Patanjali's yoga. Now, Swami Vivekananda kind of muddies the waters a little bit, kind of complicates things by throwing in practices that you don't find in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra at all, like Kundalini Yoga, and the awakening of the Kundalini. That's not part of Patanjali's yoga, actually. But he brings it in. And so, if you really want to press me on it, I'll say that even Raja Yoga is not strictly Patanjali. It's kind of Patanjali combined with a little Vedanta and a little Tantra, because Kundalini is actually a tantric practice. So that gets a little complicated. But let's stick to Patanjali just to make things a little bit easier. And I'm not going to go into detail about that's a separate lecture to talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. But basically, Patanjali's yoga is based on Sankhya philosophy. And Sankhya says that there are two basic realities. One is Purusha, the other is Prakriti. Purusha means the eternal soul. And just like these Bhakti schools of Vedanta, Sankhya and Yoga also teach that each of us has a different eternal individual soul. Okay? And we suffer because we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. Does this ring bells? This is common across not just Vedanta, Sankhya and Yoga accept the same idea. Almost all the spiritual schools within Hinduism accept this. Okay. We suffer because we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. Through spiritual practice, we can break our identification with the psychophysical complex and realize our true natures as Purushas. That's the term they use. Vedanta uses just a different term for the same idea, Atman. But it's the same thing as the Sankhya Yoga concept of Purusha. Okay? And Patanjali asks, how do we attain our knowledge of our true nature as Purusha? You have to engage in what he calls Ashtanga Yoga, the eight-limbed yoga. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but the first two are Yama and Niyama. These are ethical practices. Be truthful at all times. Practice celibacy and self-restraint. And there's a whole list of things that they ask you. Practice non-injury toward creatures. Always think of God. And then the third is what's called asana. And many of you probably have heard of the term asana. Because these days, when we hear asana, we think of downward dog and a bunch of other asanas. That's not what Patanjali means by asana at all. He defines asana as any posture which feels very comfortable and which helps you keep still for a long period of time. Why? Because the main practice, the highest kind of practice, according to Patanjali, is meditation, Jnana. That's the seventh unit, right? Jnana with Samadhi, out of the 8. Right? So you have to be able to sit still for a long period of time in order to ultimately, get up to the 7th and 8th stages. That's Patanjali's idea. Nothing to do with the Hatha Yoga techniques and physical postures. The idea is to meditate. Okay. And some of our monks, we make a joke about how yoga is taught in the West. We teach, it should be 8-limbed yoga, but we teach 6-limbed yoga. And especially focusing on asana, except that we completely transform asana into downward dog and other things. But we completely downplay or ignore yama and niyama, those first 2 steps, ethical prerequisites. Because it's not glamorous and it's not fun, and you might lose 90% of your audience if you emphasize renunciation too much. And it's true in general. All these paths, all these popular spiritual kind of movements like mindfulness, which is a wonderful technique. And these mindfulness retreats, I'm sure Swami Medhanandaji, some of them, they're wonderful, right? But if you go back to the original texts, and I'm talking about the Satipatthana Sutta, for instance, Buddha's teachings on mindfulness, there he says that you need to combine mindfulness meditation with ethical living. But you find that that's kind of downplayed in many modern versions of mindfulness, modern versions of Advaita, modern versions of yoga when we teach yoga. But if you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, you cannot divorce ethical life and ethical practice from our spiritual practices. The two things are inextricably interlinked. And Swamiji, though, also gives this. So the narrower understanding of Raja Yoga is Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And if you want a more, slightly more kind of scholarly technical explanation of Raja Yoga according to Swami Vivekananda, it's Patanjali's Yoga Sutra combined with some elements of Tantra, like Kundalini Yoga, and some elements of Jnana. But Swami Vivekananda also understands Raja Yoga in a broader sense. Just as he defines Jnana Yoga in the broader sense as philosophy or intellectual reasoning, he defines Raja Yoga using some really interesting terms in this broader sense. Psychic control. And another term he uses is mysticism. These are very interesting terms. See how broad they are. Any spiritual practice that involves meditation, any attempt to control the mind, that will include mindfulness, for instance. Even though you don't find it, I mean, actually, I argue that you do find it in Patanjali's yoga. I have an article on this, 1.19 if you're interested. There's a term, smriti, which I think not coincidentally is the same term in Buddhism, sati, for mindfulness. And so I claim, and actually, some people say that Yoga Sutra was influenced by Buddhism. It's post-Buddhistic, and so it's not a coincidence that its understanding of, Patanjali's understanding of smriti, this practice of mindfulness, is going to go back to Buddhist mindfulness. Okay, but there's a whole other can of worms. But this broader understanding of Raja Yoga is any spiritual practice involving control of mind, restraint of mind, meditation. And you'll find meditation techniques in all the world religious traditions. You'll find it in Buddhism, you'll find it in Christianity, in Islam, look at Sufi mystics. And mysticism, notice. Any spiritual practice with the aim of mystical realization, spiritual realization itself is a kind of Raja Yoga. You see. And anything involving concentration of the mind. Any spiritual practice involving concentration. So Bhakti Yoga in a way is kind of inseparable from Raja Yoga, because if you're trying to concentrate on God, take God's name, doing japa, all of this has an element of Raja Yoga in it, in the broader sense, because it involves meditation and concentration, right? Okay. Now, we don't have too much more time, so I wanted to mention, let me go straight into what are some of the unique features of the four yogas as taught in our specific spiritual tradition. That means the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Sharada Devi, and Swami Medhanandaji. One of the distinctive features you'll find is, we talked about this briefly either yesterday or the day before. In the traditional schools of Vedanta, one yoga is always placed on a higher footing than the other yogas. Invariably. Shankara places, as you said, I remember, the path of knowledge above Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga. The Bhakti schools place Bhakti Yoga, not surprisingly, over Jnana Yoga and over Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is kind of always the poor, it's never the highest. Except Gandhi, interestingly, when he has an entire commentary on the Gita. And he says Karma Yoga is the highest in a certain sense, the yoga of non-attachment. But he also says that's inseparable from Bhakti. He was a great Bhakta, so Gandhi. Now, where do Sri Ramakrishna, where does the holy trio stand on this issue? They say, forget about this higher and lower stuff. Take your pick of the yogas, whichever yoga best suits your temperament, whatever yoga you feel will help you to make the most rapid spiritual progress. All of them are on an equal footing. It's a really radical teaching within the context of traditional Vedanta. That's why it's helpful to know something about traditional Vedanta, in order to know what's most unique and important, and how relevant it is to our daily lives, right? Doesn't that, it helps free us. Because we don't need to feel guilty about practicing bhakti. Some of us, it's incredible to me. Some people, when they practice bhakti, are saying, yeah, I practice bhakti, but I know that at the end of the day, this God I'm worshiping is not real. But I'm just not strong enough to realize that now. I wish I could practice the path of knowledge. You don't beat yourself up about it. No, you shouldn't feel guilty about practicing bhakti or karma yoga because I'm not eligible to practice jnana yoga, not like that. No, you should feel that God is real, fully real. So remember Vijnana Vedanta from yesterday. One of the main tenets is the infinite divine reality is not only impersonal but also personal. Not only Brahman but also Shakti. If you accept that, then automatically Bhakti Yoga is placed on an equal footing with the path of knowledge. Why? Because Bhakti Yoga corresponds to the Shakti, which is fully real. And Jnana Yoga corresponds to the impersonal dimension of the same infinite reality, right? So you have to have some philosophical understanding to understand how all four yogas can be on an equal footing. And once you do, you can combine, you can practice any of the yogas you want. Each one of them will take you to the highest goal. That's one thing to keep in mind. Secondly, our tradition strongly encourages each of us as spiritual aspirants to try to combine the four yogas to the best of our ability. Why? Because we are all complex personalities. We have different dimensions to the human personality. One is the volitional aspect. That means the doing aspect. We want to do things. Karma Yoga is perfectly suited to cultivate that dimension, to spiritualize that dimension, that volitional dimension of our personality. But we're also emotional beings, some more than others, but still everybody's emotional to some extent. Bhakti Yoga is the yoga that helps to purify and cultivate and spiritualize the emotional dimension of our natures. We also have brains, an intellectual dimension to our nature. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, helps us to cultivate our intellects and give them a kind of spiritual turn. And each of us has a faculty of concentration and meditation. Raja Yoga helps us to cultivate that faculty. And so, doesn't it make sense to try to combine all four yogas? Because then we're harnessing all of the energies of the human personality, right? It doesn't mean that you have to combine them, but it helps. Another great advantage of combining the four yogas is it helps us to avoid becoming fanatics. Because if we only practice one yoga, we might easily slip into this kind of dogmatic attitude that my way or the highway. And you start looking down on others who practice a yoga that's different from yours. So you broaden yourself, you broaden your horizons when you practice all four yogas. You can sympathize with everybody. That's the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Medhanandaji used to say, Sri Ramakrishna's greatness was that he was as deep as the ocean and as vast and broad as the skies. That combination is extremely rare, even among realized souls. It's very interesting, because many realized souls, they arrived at that realization through intense, one-pointed focus on and worship of their particular chosen ideal. It requires a certain depth, but at the same time, there's a danger of fanaticism there. It's at the expense of breadth, often, not always, but often. But Sri Ramakrishna somehow had infinite depth and infinite breadth. This is very rare. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is each of us is evolving as spiritual aspirants. And so it might be that at this particular point in time, the yoga that is most suited to me is, let's say, Bhakti yoga. And that doesn't mean I should just practice Bhakti. It means that the other yogas can be kind of satellites around Bhakti yoga, which is my core practice, right? But it might be that 20 years later, I might find that, well, wait a minute, now I feel like Jnana yoga is better suited to where I am now. You might evolve away from one yoga toward another, which means you don't stop practicing Bhakti. That becomes a satellite around Jnana yoga, which becomes a central practice. And so even a single individual can evolve in terms of which yoga is their main yoga and how the different yogas relate to each other. There's no one-size-fits-all formula. That's another nice thing about Vedanta is, and I'll end on this. Swami Medhanandaji, he used to say, he said, no person is born into a religion. Each person has a religion in the depths of his or her soul. And the first step in spiritual life is asking yourself, or trying to kind of tap into, what is that custom-made, individualized religion meant just for me? In light of my personality, my strengths, and my weaknesses, right? And one of the best ways to discover what that religion of your soul and your soul and your soul is to practice all four yogas. Because if you don't expose yourself to the different yogas, how are you going to know what that soul religion, that religion that's meant for you really is? So another thing, it's a lovely statement he made. He said, some people lament the fact that, and they almost criticize religion for splitting into different sects. You have Christianity, then suddenly you get Catholicism and Protestantism, and then within Catholicism you got Buddhism. Almost immediately after Buddha's death, you get Mahayana Buddhism, you get Theravada Buddhism, you get Hinduism. There's no end to the number of sects within Hinduism. Swamiji says, instead of lamenting that fact or using it as a basis for criticism of religion, he says we should celebrate the fact that every religion will eventually split into sects. He says, I wish that every religion would eventually multiply until every human being had his or her own sect. What a beautiful idea. It's the same idea as every human being on earth, all the billions of people on earth. Each one has a unique religion in the depths of his or her soul. It's custom made just for me. And I can discover that by practicing all of these yogas all at once. And then ultimately I'll arrive at that religion that's custom made for me. And then by practicing that religion, I'll make the most spiritual progress. Thank you.
Wow.
So, questions?
Somebody's got to be first.
I hope this is more practical, a little more practical. Not that yesterday was bad, but it gives a framework for understanding the practices today. Yeah, please.
Say something.
And your name is Scott, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Scott.
I think that where you fall within these four yogas, to me, what I see is that there are certain saints, certain gurus that have come along that I've read about or read their actual teachings that speak to me. So that puts me in a certain category,
Yeah.
so to speak, just because I don't know why that would be, but that speaks to me. So I practice what
Sure.
they suggested.
Yeah.
And I like what you said about that ultimately each individual, like if each individual had their own sect.
Yeah.
Because I think that you can only, each teacher has a set of pointers.
Yeah.
And those pointers can only take you so far.
Yeah.
But at some point, you have to go past the pointers.
Yeah.
And so that's where all comes together.
Yeah.
And so that's how I see it. And
No, I think that's great. I think that's right. Yeah. No, I think that's pretty much along the lines of what I was saying. Is that, yeah, if you read certain teachings of a great master and you feel that they resonate with you, then by all means you should practice that yoga. But don't shut yourself to other possibilities. And yeah, I think that. And another thing that I would have mentioned if I had more time, but now I'll mention it now. There's a thinker named Fritjof Schuon, who's also famous for teaching the harmony of religions. He wrote a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religions. And he makes this wonderful statement there where he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, every religion has a unique strength, says something or gets something right, or gets something better than any other religion in the world does. And I like that. I mean, you can find, if you're generous, you'll find that every single religion gets something more right than every other religion, or explains something better than any other religion does. And what does that mean? It means that we can stand to learn something from every great spiritual tradition. That's the idea. We should have that attitude of generosity and openness, it seems to me. That you can have deep commitment toward and faith in your particular yoga, your path. But each of us can learn from the other yogas and the other great religious scriptures and the other great spiritual traditions, in my view. Yeah, anyone else? Yeah, please.
I guess I agree with you on practicing the core yoga
Yeah.
because I think at every point in our life we're going to be in a situation where Bhakti would be more appropriate
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
Jnana. But
Right.
my personal concern about it is digging a lot of shallow holes, and
Right,
bouncing around, and not really
right.
getting in deep enough to
Right.
actually make progress.
Dive deep. That's a great concern. And I was going to talk about it if I had more time. I just skipped quite a large parts of what I wanted to talk about. Yeah, Sri Ramakrishna used to warn. He said, if you start digging in one place, and after 5 minutes you say, I'm getting bored, let me move 6 feet away, and you start digging another one. So you never strike water, which is 10 feet deep, let's say. You have to dig deep in one place. Likewise, if we're spiritual dabblers or spiritual dilettantes, and one day we're engaging in Christianity, and then the next day it's Islam, and the next day it's Jnana Yoga, and the next day it's... We're not going to make that much spiritual progress. But we talked about this, I think, yesterday, the day before. Spiritual shopping is very valuable, but in the early initial phase, in being a spiritual aspirant, you should expose yourself to all traditions. That's what I call spiritual shopping. Like Amazon, you compare different products. I did that myself literally because I was agnostic growing up, and then I think we talked about it on Friday. And so I was reading the Bible, but also reading the Quran, and also reading Buddhist scripture, reading the Gita, and kind of looking at it. And so there's a time and place for that. But eventually you have to move past that. When you do, when you're ready, when you've committed to a particular tradition as your main tradition, you have to dive deep in that tradition. That's a must. That often means the first step is initiation. We have initiation in our tradition, and so that's a really important step. And then that gives you the tools to go even deeper in the tradition. Some people are hesitant to get initiated. That suggests that they're not fully committed yet to that tradition or that path, right? But once you are, dive deep. Once you have established your anchor in your own home tradition, then you can freely draw on and learn from other religious traditions without feeling that conflict or that danger, because you're no longer superficial. You're already deeply anchored in your own tradition. And on that basis, you can confidently learn from other traditions. That's the way I see it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Perfectly, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
You just made a statement about that author before about the sorry, about,
Martin Seligman
it'll
was
come back to me.
authentic happiness? No, or was it
Um, No, the one you just said before she asked the question, I'm sorry.
what else did I mention?
It'll come back to me.
Okay, all right, we'll come back. Let us know. It
Yeah.
happens to me a lot, so. I can say-
Oh, it's about, I
There we go.
remember now.
Yes.
About, how each religion has something great.
Yeah, right, for
And
Chuck
I'm
Schuon, yeah, yeah.
wondering what you think about the Bhakti Vedanta. What is so great about it that in the scheme of that, is there one thing that you really resonates with you about what's so great about it?
Yeah, sure, that's a wonderful question. Let me read you the exact statement of Schuon's, just because
Okay.
you've raised it. He says, in the Transcendent Unity of Religions, the truth is that every religious form is superior to the others in a particular respect. Seems very simple, but there's something very profound in that. Every religion is superior to other religions in some respect. It kills fanaticism, if you really accept that. Because that means that every person is superior to every other person in some respect. I think we can almost say that. It might be that people are really terrible, like, overall, but that they're really good at something. I can guarantee every single person, damn, this guy's good at poker, or
That's awesome.
something
Yeah,
that.
totally. That's
Right?
awesome.
And so generosity, one part of generosity is finding out that one unique thing that that person has over everybody else. And so you're asking that question about what do I think Advaita Vedanta has over, and by Advaita Vedanta, we have to be more specific and say, Shankara's Advaita, let's say, just so
Okay.
that there's no ambiguity, because I talked about Advaita Vedanta yesterday.
I'm sure
but
it's a big, broad.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
However, just as a
Right,
point.
just, yeah, so like one of them is, it's tremendously rational. It doesn't ask you to believe in X, Y, or Z. There are some beliefs, and there is a faith component to it. There's basically, the faith element is, you have to have faith in the Upanishads, which tell you that in your deepest essence, you are none other than non-dual pure consciousness. But beyond that kind of initial kind of faith, it's extremely rational. It appeals to people of a modern skeptical temperament, and it's sublime. I mean, to be told that there's one reality and it's non-dual pure consciousness, and that you are that reality. It's incredibly empowering, liberating. It's only really liberating if you're eligible, in fact. It's one of the drawbacks, as I said.
You're standing in the wrong line.
Yeah. But that's,
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, please, Vincent.
Is it also based on just a person's temperament, but is there a particular yoga you think that people should, for example, in reading Swami Medhanandaji's, what he's written, what's been written, is there something you think we should, people should focus on first? Like Bhakti, for instance, Bhakti yoga, like reading Bhakti yoga, or does it just vary?
It varies, I'd say, just because I have to first get to know you and then figure out what makes. So, because in my case, because I was so skeptical and agnostic, the text that happened to fall into my hands first, and which made me order the whole 9-volume complete works of Swami Medhanandaji, was Raja Yoga. Because right off the bat, he's addressing the skeptical scientific mind, the philosopher who's doubting everything. And so for me, that resonated, because I was so skeptical at the time. But for somebody who has an innate devotion and faith, I wouldn't recommend Raja Yoga as the first text. I would recommend Bhakti Yoga. And so it really depends, is what I'd say. So the first step in spiritual life is really about asking yourself. And this is not as easy as you might think, but what am I really? One is what I'd like to think I am, but the other is what am I really? Like I once thought that I'm such an intellectual that the path of knowledge must be the path that's meant for me. I only realized years later that it was the path of Bhakti. I'm actually a Bhakti. But Swami Medhanandaji once made a comment toward the end of his life. He told me repeatedly, he said, Sri Ramakrishna was all Bhakti on the outside and all Jnana on the inside. And he said, I'm the opposite. I'm all Jnana on the outside and all Bhakti on the inside. But I'm starting to see that I'm much more of a Bhakti than I thought I was. It requires real soul searching to and real honesty with yourself. Anyone else?
I think all these questions come down to one point probably, that you have to be really honest. Without
Honesty
that,
is with yourself and with others, with both. I mean,
every aspect.
yeah, and it's painful. Honesty is not pleasant. It really, genuinely is.
It's a practice in itself, really.
Oh, it is. It really is. The yoga of honesty. That's another yoga. Exactly. I'm serious. Because, some people are like pathological liars. That's one case. But they're ordinary people. It's not like it's not like they tell big lies most of the time, but they often will tell small lies. So-called white lies. But they're no real white lies. So if you're really strict with yourself about honesty, that itself is a yoga. In fact, that's another thing Shramji used to say. Telling the truth is itself a very potent yoga in this Kali Yuga. Because people are so prone to lying.
Yeah, I think telling the truth in the world is a practice that helps you incorporate that in when you look inward, because the mind is a very tricky thing. So you have to be able to try to discern whether what the mind is telling you about yourself is true.
That's right. Yeah.
So your practice in the world of being honest helps you think with being honest with yourself.
Absolutely, I think that's true. And I mean, honesty also helps keep you in check. Because if you really force yourself to be honest, there are a lot of things you're not going to be able to do. And people who are really good at lying, I almost admire them, because it's hard for me to do it. I can't keep a poker face. Some people are incredible.
Yeah, it brings one question from a very different aspect. I have been reading one book time and again. It's called "The Body Keeps the Score."
The body keeps
the score.
Oh, I
It's
see.
by
The body keeps the score.
Massachusetts mental hospital psychiatrist, and he analyzes our situation, like childhood situation, adult situation. And I read the chapter 8 and 9, which are basically to do with how you are groomed in your childhood. Because it says that till the age of 7, you are probably kind of an automated. You keep on absorbing it. You don't have much of a thinking factor. And he says that the rest of your life is determined by what are the circumstances you faced in those initial 7 years. And they keep on happening throughout your life repeatedly as a habitual pattern, because those things get embedded in your subconscious, which you call chitta. Right?
Yeah.
And you don't know even what is happening unless and until somebody comes and guides you. Probably there comes the actual guru, right, who has to show you the path, because it's complicated. Right?
Yeah.
Just start with me.
Yeah, no. I mean, I have to read the book to tell you how much I agree with
It's very good.
Yeah, but it sounds interesting. The body keeps the score.
The body keeps the score.
Yeah. But it does resonate with certain aspects of Vedanta and the idea.
Yeah.
And one thing I really like in Eckhart Tolle, if any of you study Eckhart Tolle's teachings, but he has this idea of the pain body. And I think it's
what?
The pain body.
Oh, yeah.
Pain body.
And that reminds me of that. It's almost visceral, right? If somebody steps on or hits one of those buttons in your pain body, you're triggered. Whatever is like the source of deepest pain, and often it stems from childhood trauma.
Yes.
And so I think that there's a real wisdom in what you're saying. Yeah, and so Eckhart Tolle will say, the big question is, how do we get rid of the pain body? He says, easy. It's not easy, but take a step back from it. Don't identify with the pain body. So long as we identify with it, so long as we are unconscious about the fact that it's there and that we're actually separate from it, so long do we separate. So, and these people who so closely identify the pain body, they're the most negative people. And it's like they thrive on negativity. Like they can't breathe without criticizing somebody else or feeling bad about themselves. It's incredible. Whereas people with positive energy are the ones that are able to take a step back from the pain body. It's not that they don't have a pain body. It's that they're not slaves to the pain body. They're not fully identified with the pain body. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Any last questions? Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Namaste.
Well, first, let's give Swamiji a great hand. I have to say, this has been an amazing 3 days for me to be here with you.
It was a pleasure.
I wish you guys could have been with us the whole 3 days. It was really amazing. Yeah, right. Sleep over next time. And we do have Swamiji coming back in November, the first weekend of November. he is booked and set in stone, so we're for sure gonna have.
He's holding me to it.
Yeah. So we'll do the sleepover with the pajamas and all that.
Alright.
So upcoming events, so that you guys know, we have Swami Medhanandaji, he's the president of this center, and he's coming on the 6th of September. He's always here the first Wednesday, so that you guys know that. We have another senior Swami called Swami Medhanandaji. He was here before. He's coming again on the 15th, 16th, and 17th. And I'll be sending out emails for that. So we'll do a similar kind of a thing, a 3-day. We really work, Swami. 3 days straight, heavy duty lectures and stuff.
But I really got to get to know him, which is great. Yeah.
It's kind of nice having more than one day,
It was
isn't
nice.
it? Where
it was nice, yeah.
you can kind of build on.
That's right.
things
The
and-
previous days.
Mhm.
I think that's what we miss in this center,
Right.
no relationship with the
Right.
big Shamijis
Yeah.
who can give us some knowledge.
Yeah.
So
Oh, but
that,
he's really doing his best, and it's tremendous.
Yeah,
He's
no.
able to invite different swamis, and
I think I have
Right.
one.
and one thing that's useful about not having a resident swami is that you're exposed to so many different kinds of. Every swami is different,
no, I don't mind it
and
anyway.
yeah,
But that
Since,
gives you the,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
peace of
since
mind.
physical distance is a problem, in this kind of session, according to the availability of the time, they can be organized with Zoom or something.
Well, he does live streams, right?
All of these are live streamed.
So that we can interact, a little bit interactive.
Oh, I see. Like, is there a chat option on?
Yeah,
there
there's
is.
chat on, because Zoom doesn't have very good audio. And we've just had now 2 YouTube. So we're doing YouTube lives, and it's much better quality, and they save it directly to YouTube, so it's always available on our
And
channel.
if you have
or on-
questions, you can add it to the chat.
That's a
box.
chat line.
Yeah,
Because on-
We do that in Hollywood. We live stream it on YouTube, and then anybody
Right.
online is watching can ask questions, and I go through them, and if they're really dumb questions or irrelevant questions, I don't answer them. But I try to handpick the ones.
so, and Swami hit on something very important. We're trying to bring in a Swami Medhanandaji every month, as usual, but then one other Swami also in a month, every month. So we do have Swami Samanasanandaji in September, we have Swami Arupeshanandaji in October, and of course we have
Yeah.
Swami.
Each swami is so different. You'll see that. And that's nice.
And we will have, we've been talking about Swami Sarvapriyanandaji
Yeah.
Next year, so we're building this up, Now I feel confident after this.
I'll talk you guys up to Sarvapriya.
Yeah, he's good friends, so.
Yeah, yeah.
Honestly, this is the first time I felt confident to really say, okay,
Yeah,
if
no.
we can, and we had
This is a
weather
good-
against us, we
yeah.
had, summer, everybody's on vacation.
Yeah,
So I think we're really ready for something like that.
sure.
By the way, I will be out of town, and so we will have just RT here. I think Debbie's gonna do the RT, but I'll be out of town this week for the next 3 weeks, and we'll be here.
Yeah,
So we
but
won't
we
have,
will not have our thing next Saturday.
okay,
We will have, after that, 2 Saturdays, we will have.
okay, I'll put it out for you guys. If you wanna come and just have a nice RT and
Yeah,
just put
it's-
some flowers,
what
there
are
won't be
the
class or
dates?
anything.
Tell
So
me
the dates are gonna be this.
2nd and 9th, I think.
Yeah, let me think, no, actually, it's gonna be more than that, because I'm gone the 26th, the 2nd and the 9th.
Yeah, so 2nd
Yeah,
and
2nd and 9th,
9th,
she
we
will do it. We'll send it out, we'll send out the emails, just so you know, and then when I'm back, we're gonna start the classes back up Saturday, so we usually Saturday, and we're kind of arranging the best time, we were doing 4 o'clock. So we do a full puja, which you can hear and take part in, and then we do a meditation, and then we do a class, we do the reading on the gospel, and we discuss it. So if you guys want to add your understanding of what the gospel is saying, but we really kind of go back what the cultural realities were. I mean, a lot of these things, there's so much meaning that we miss if we're not aware of why he's saying
Yeah,
something,
yeah.
or who these people are that are in this narrative. So it's kind of neat. So all of you, I'm sure, can add some of it, especially the Indian devotees have understandings that, Westerners don't. And of course, I've kind of been going to India for 30 years, so it's kind of like a home. So we're going to be doing that as well. So we want to invite everybody. And then we'll start with the new devotees. We have 7 new people that got initiation. We're going to start a class on just reading through the Ramakrishna and his disciples, because that's a really great introduction to everybody. So if we go through that together, then when you dive into the Gospel of Ramakrishna, all of these things will be clear to you. What was the reality, what was the cultural reality? I mean, they were, how did England and India, what was their relationship? That all that has a huge amount of meaning inside of the narratives. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Swami. And so you guys are gonna be able to now put your flowers, if you wanna put some flowers out. I'm gonna cut some more because we have time. And feel free. And somebody wanted to see all the people, so I'm gonna show all of your faces to the crowd on the YouTube. Okay, thank you guys from the YouTube.
Okay. That's what we did. Okay, thank you. Good.
Okay.